17-year-old flight cadet Cassandra Thorne takes to the skies in the biomechanical fighters left behind when her world was conquered by the Wasp Armada, forming her own band of liberated slaves to combat the parasite city that has imprisoned, free will and enslaved the minds and bodies of her people. With her entry into the alien hive mind, she's not there to destroy it, but to infuse the idea of personal choice, ultimately transforming both species into something new, as well as a state of being that's more cooperative and less forced. The first time Cassandra Thorne witnessed a Wasp Armada rising from the red skies, she was 17, and she had thought the worst thing that could ever happen to her was when she failed her pilot certification 1 week before her 18th birthday. The titanic biomechanical combat ants folded in and out of the dimming light of humanity's sun as they scythe-thrusted their way through Earth's atmosphere. Each was the size of a small building, and their hulls, covered in organic ripples, pulsed with an alien heartbeat. The noise they produced wasn't the howl of engines though, not even close. It was a guttural low boom that felt as though it vibrated her insides. She'd been running aerobatics in her family's aging cargo hauler when the first wave had hit. Panic exploded across the communication channels when one city and then another went dark. Her father came over the radio, his voice thick with desperation and breaking. "Cassie, get home now. Avoid the main flight paths. Stay low." But by the time she had made her way to the farming settlement of New Haven, there was no homecoming. The Wasp fighters had been meticulous. The structures looked like they had been liquefied instead of demolished, and the steel had softened into curves. Even the ground itself had been pitted with deep trenches that shimmered with a strange blue phosphorescence. And into the destruction, she came upon the first of the changed. Her kid brother, Marcus, was standing in what was no longer their kitchen, though he was no longer Marcus. His skin was acquiring a translucent quality, and beneath it, she could see something undulating networks of thin fiber-optic tendrils, pulsing with the same blue light as the trenches. When he faced her, his eyes were compound, flat, like those of an insect. He spoke in a voice that wasn't, and yet was, his, with overtones that made her teeth throb. "Sister," he bellowed. And there was no way that human vocal cords should be able to produce such a sound. "It's too late to join, but not too late to serve." She ran. Cassandra had spent 3 months surviving in the wreckage of the world, searching for the things that they needed and evading both the patrols and the eyes. The Wasp Armada had not won Earth with pure might. It had won it with metamorphosis. They didn't destroy humans, they perfected them, or that's what the converted said. All who underwent the process were incorporated into a collective mind, with their incomprehensibly vast numbers of sentient minds joining the collective, living network that operated under the guidance of the Hive Queens. But other humans could not be remade. Their neuronal patterns did not match the biomechanical gateways. These discordants were pursued mercilessly, not from cruelty, but because their very presence was considered to be a kind of mental illness that could spread. Cassandra was one of them. She learned to recognize the signs to warn her of an oncoming Wasp patrol, the objects of metal beginning to hum in anticipation, the slight change in air pressure, the way insects blithely fell silent. She mastered traveling through the altered reality, finding her way with phosphorescent trenches for guidance, bypassing the nodes of the newly made humans, those who all came together for a more complete sharing of what they had collectively become. It was on one of these desperate flights that she found the graveyard, buried under the remnants of Edwards Air Force Base. In a reinforced bunker that had somehow missed the first wave of conversion, she had found them. Scores of Wasp fighters, their living carapace now dark and still. They had been disabled in the first skirmishes, their pilots shot or fled, but the craft had all been left mostly intact. And as she neared the first one, reaching out to touch its glistening carapace, she sensed the response in her skin, the hull heating up beneath her fingers, and suddenly she was overwhelmed by sensations that were not hers. She could feel the ship's distress, its bewilderment at missing the collective awareness that had steered it. But there was something more, a hunger, a passion for flight that echoed the desperate yearning for freedom in her own heart. There was nothing that human technology had ever cobbled together like the biomechanical interface. It was controlled, not through buttons and dials, but through thought and feeling. But as importantly, it called for a level of mental symbiosis which was otherwise attainable only through the change. Cassandra shouldn't have been able to communicate with it in any way, but she was discordant, and that made all the difference. Where optimates had blended perfectly with their ships, she had done something else. Her anarchic neural patterns had created a bond that was passionate, volatile, exclusively her own. The ship was not only at her control, It was, quite literally, mere-driven, converting her rage to unrefined force. Her desperate struggle to survive to a near preternatural alertness to her surroundings. It was a disaster. Her first flight, the ship lurched in response to her untrained thoughts, almost crashing to the ceiling of the bunker before she brought it under control to minimize damage. But there was a catch. With each try, the signal grew stronger. She learned to communicate with the ship in its language of electrical impulses, in feelings and thoughts rather than words. The boat had a name, she discovered. Not a number out of a set of designations, but a phrase that more or less said Defiant Wing. It was one of the first to go down in the first wave. Its pilot, killed by a band of human resistance fighters who had found a way to take advantage of the vulnerability of the biomechanical systems. It had been waiting on the ship since then, loyal to Collective that had deserted it. As the weeks continued to pass, they evolved into something unheard of, a human-wasp hybrid, but remained outside the dreaming of the Collective. She sensed the ship's memories, flashes of the spreading web of consciousness that used to direct its actions, but she could also feel its increasing attachment to her, something that was growing beyond the scope of what it had been programmed for. She almost gave up the first time. She came across a wasp patrol. The human that had converted begged her, through the speakers in the ship, and she could feel the humanity in his voice as if it was the real fear for her safety. They failed to grasp why she kept fighting them, joining the Collective and ending her misery, whilst finding her purpose. One of them was her former neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who had taught her to play piano at the age of 7. "Cassandra, dear," said Mrs. Chen's voice, reaching her through the biomechanical interface in words that seemed both confiding and wise, and which, although earrigged into her brain, echoed with harmonics indicative of broad learning and serene blues-and-night happiness. "You don't have to be alone now. All that we can remove is your pain, your fear, your confusion. You can be part of something bigger." Cassandra almost believed her for a moment. The solitude was unbearable, and persistent dread of exposure had worn her to a shred. But then she felt Defiant Wing's reaction to her mood, an almost elemental protectiveness that was nothing to do with programming, all to do with what they had built together. She peeled towards the patrol, accelerating her ship beyond the capacity of any ship that was battered as her fighter. But Defiant Wing had responded to her desperation, its bizarre neuromechanical systems finding some way to interface with her own out-of-control neural nets in ways that made it stronger, faster, more agile than it had ever been in concert with others. That night, while sitting in the ship's cozy cockpit, she made a choice that would alter everything. She shouted at the other ships that were abandoned, that it was both dangerous and exhausting. Each ship she tried to join with demanded that her mind be wide open, threatening to expose her to a remnant collective mind that plagued any ship. She tried to bond with some ships, turned her away, too much of their programming damaged or too dedicated to the original collective. Others had almost driven her mad with their alien thoughts and memories. But slowly, one at a time, she started to build her own swarm. Her second shipmate she made a successful bond with had been a heavy assault fighter, the pilot of which had died in a crash during the first battles. It was called Thunderheart, and it held within it the accumulated memories of 1,000 star systems that she'd never heard of, let alone visited, that had been the site of fierce and terrible battles. The third was a scout ship with the code name Shadow Dance, fast and nimble, its biomechanical systems designed for scouting operations, as well as for stealth. Each bond had been unique, each ship an answer to a different part of her personality. Thunderheart fueled her anger, transforming the grief she felt for her lost family into a weapon. Shadow Dance resonated with her desire to be free, her wish to pass through the changed world unnoticed. And Defiant Wing was still her ever-present companion, her teacher in what it was to be truly free. But she had the hardest time bonding with the ship that came last. At the furthest point in the graveyard, buried under the rubble of larger combatants, she found a vessel unlike any of the others. It was smaller, it was more streamlined, its biomech body scarred, and telling marvelous tales of conflict. Seeing the final item and touching it, she was immediately assaulted by presence that was vastly alien compared to the others. It was once flown by a hive queen. The thoughts that couldn't have been formed and flooding through her mind. She'd been there for the birth of collective consciousness, the gradual transformation of a species that had been as single-minded as people were once. She shared the awful desolation of the first queen with the overwhelming desire to make a connection that had fueled the design of the biomechanical interfaces, and she watched the moment when that other queen had known what she had done, how her wish itself was a form of bondage. The name of the ship was Regret's Edge, and it bore the regret of its foe or pilot as something akin to a physical weight. The Queen had died attempting to escape her own making, struggling with the collective unconscious that she truly was part of creating. Her ship had been locked up, classified too dangerous for common use, nearly dying at the hands of regrets. Edge had bonded her to those knives. Its systems were more advanced than those of the others, biomechanisms designed to accommodate the vast consciousness of a hive queen, but she was discordant, and she managed to create something the ship had never known. Instead of dominance and control, she offered partnership. Instead of groupthink, she conferred a riotous beauty upon it by individual thought. Cassandra realized at last what she had done. With 4 ships in her possession, she was not simply flying wasp fighters. She was leading them through a consciousness that was unlike that of humans or aliens, one that was totally different. The ships obeyed her emotions, her thoughts, her will. Yet not in the end did they lose their own personalities, their own wants and fears. At all times now, she could feel them inside her mind, for presence is as real now as her own thoughts. The fierce loyalty of Defiant Wing, the barely leashed rage of Thunderheart, the playful curiosity in Shadow Dance, and the deep sadness of Regret's Edge. They were her family now. They were the only family she had. She used her swarm in combat the first time to save a group of human survivors trapped by a wasp patrol. The fight was over within minutes. Her vessels flew with seemingly preternatural synchronization, the organic systems going to work and effortlessly disabling the attacking fighters without destroying them. But it wasn't the commander's efficiency that had surprised her. It was the fact that her ships had moved without her guidance to protect the human survivors, even at the expense of tactical superiority. They had been given compassion by her. In the ensuing months, Cassandra and her rampage were the stuff of legend amongst the remaining human resistance. They showed up out of nowhere, attacking wasp sites and vanishing before backup could respond. But they did not kill the humans, converted into monsters, did not wipe out the infrastructure that sustained the surviving human population. Instead, they worked to bring the hive mind down, aiming to break their communication channels and prevent the hive queens from being able to direct their forces. It was on one of these raids when she learned the truth about the Wasp Armada. Deep within a bio-mechanical-operating-shop py-and-thin ky-marjig, she found records that were locked out even to the converted humans. It used to be that the wasp species weren't one hive mind, for they had once been people, with their own cultures, their own conflicts, their own dreams. Biomechanical interfaces was something that had been invented in the aftermath of a terrible war that had almost ended their culture, but the remedy had become worse than the disease. Their individuality had been absorbed by the mass consciousness, and they were perfect, efficient, unemotional creations. They had conquered world after world, not through malice, but because they truly believed that they saved other species from the chaos of individual thought. They also uncovered something else: the whereabouts of the primary hive, the behemoth that unified the whole of the collective intelligence. It had been somehow hidden in the Earth's outer atmosphere, shielded by sophisticated technology that rendered it undetectable by human senses. And at its center was the original queen, the first of her kind to experience the change. She was dying. The biomechanical conduits of immortality were failing, and with them, the group soul. The Wasp Armada's mad and violent spread throughout the galaxy wasn't that of a conqueror, but one of a race searching both for a fix, for the way to keep the whole alive upon the incandescent shores of its own coming apart all at once. Cassandra knew then that she had knowledge of all things. Her dissonant manifesting, her capacity to have relations with the biomechanical systems without losing herself was all that mattered to the collective. She could perhaps stand between chaos and order, between private thought and shared consciousness. But she would have to give up everything she had worked for. The decision troubled her for weeks. She felt her ships waver, then confusion as she wrestled the decision. They could not figure out why she was contemplating becoming part of the very collective they had been warring against. But they believed in her, and that belief may have been the most painful thing of all. It was Regret's Edge that finally gave her the answer. The ship accessed a memory from the previous human who had unseated the Hive Queen before dying in the attempt to break free of the collective. And in the end, the Queen had understood that the only way she could save her people was by reteaching them to be people. But she had been too enmeshed in the collective consciousness to emerge single-minded. Cassandra could accomplish what the Queen couldn't. She could move in among the group mind and still retain some vestigial sense of self, inserting her jangled neural patterns into the perfect homogeneity of the collective single will. She could teach them freedom that never in the history of mankind had any similar attack been carried out on the Prime Hive. Cassandra's quartet of ships slid forwards through the shrouded formation, living units whose biomechanical structures melded with the defensive mechanisms of the colossal installation. But what they exported was not an attack, but something much more dangerous: the idea of choice. Each and every system they'd touched was infected with the chaos of Cassandra's brain pattern. The decision trees that had worked purely on logic were now disrupted because they had to take emotion into account. Channels of communication once opened and crystal clear were now submerged in confusion and doubt. The group mind, whose modus operandi had been complete unity, suddenly confronted the awful prospect of dissension. The original queen had been patiently awaiting her at the center of the building, her body now more machine than organic after thousands of years of biomechanical fusion, beautiful and terrible as the morning and the night, fair as the sea and the sun and the snow upon the mountain, dreadful as the storm and the lightning, stronger than the foundations of the earth. All shall love me and despair. She was beautiful, as SH was terrible. All that has been already said and concluded. Ancient as a memory interminable, and dying with the inevitable slowness of a sunset. You have come to annihilate us. The queen replied with a voice that sounded as sensuous of a billion minds. I'm here to rescue you, Cassandra answered, her palm flat on the interface console that would link her into the collective existence. All of you. The queen's gaze sought her with the wisdom of the ages in its depths. You can't save us without destroying us. What you are is already dying, suggested Cassandra softly. I'm asking you to be something new. As soon as she put the interface on, Cassandra felt her mind become suddenly huge in a way that she couldn't have dreamed was possible. Now she was linked to every human made human on the planet, every flesh wasp in the Armada, every biomechanical unit in the collective. It should have wiped her individual identity away, should have merged her with the perfect unity of the hive mind. But her discordant self made her a virus to the system. Her scrambled sense of self rippled through the shared self as a contagion. Uncertainty in place of affirmation, emotion rather than reason, choice rather than submission. The impact was quick and devastating. All over the world, converted humans began, with suddenness, to have the notion of thinking alone after months of suspension. The spell of the Wasp warriors was broken as their drivers remembered individual lusts. Biomechanical units malfunctioned as they were given conflicting orders. The collective consciousness was splintering. But it was not dying, it was evolving. The original queen was there, in her mind, ancient and grand but no longer ruling. It was the first time in literally thousands of years that the queen had felt uncertainty, fear, hope, emotions that the hive had attempted to remove. What have you done to us? The queen murmured, though there was wonder in her tone and not accusation. I've taken your choice away from you, said Cassandra. You can rebuild the collective, if you like. You can bring about a new kind of unity without asking for the death of individuality, or you can stay apart and learn to be individuals again. The choice is yours. It took months to make the change. Some other humans who had been perverted by the collective would stay carted to the network, but it was no longer enslavement but association by consent. Based on the values and interests, they organized into communities, with the biomechanical interfaces helping them work together rather than think together. Still others went in the opposite direction, but back to a lack of dependence, having their bionic implants removed and living life as humans. The detox was challenging, but they had each other and the camaraderie of people who had made the same decision. The Wasp Armada went through a transformation like that itself. Most of the warriors decide to stay on Earth, their pilots adopting Earth's custom, if not custom, technology. Others headed out to the stars, taking the message of choice to other colonized worlds. Cassandra was part of it in the middle, not exactly human anymore, but still not completely alien. Her bond with the 4 ships had mutated into something unheard of, a kind of consciousness that was either unique or shared, clumped or loose, and of the people and the alien. She might have assumed control over the entire graph, might have been the new head of the mutated colony, but she chose something different. She decided to stay a guardian, a connector of species that now shared the planet. Her fleet yet clung to her, but they had ceased to be the weapons of war. Defiant Wing became an emblem of resistance turned to hope. Thunderheart had learned to turn its anger outward into defense instead of destruction. Shadow Dance was exploration over escape, and Regret's Edge was now at peace. Knowing it had not been a vain sacrifice made by its former pilot, the original queen chose to still be part of the collective, but in a different function, not a command and control consciousness, but a guide. She taught others to balance the tension of being an individual with a motley crew and a rowboat. She and Cassandra had become great friends, two creatures which had outgrown their original form to become something else. Years went by, and the world recovered. The glowing ditches had been turned into gardens in which biomechanical plants flourished, following both aesthetic and practical designs. Entire cities destroyed by the enemy were reconstructed, using a fusion of human engineering and WASP bioscience, as living, sentient dwellings optimized for the needs of their inhabitants. Cassandra visited the ruins of New Haven regularly, where her quest had started. The site had become a memorial, but not only for the human lives lost in the invasion. It was there for all who had died in the change, human or WASP, everyone who had beaten and strove for freedom, and freedom in unity. She occasionally sensed her brother's presence while standing among the living memorial structures. Marcus had chosen to stay in the compound, but he'd also chosen to forgive. Their relationship had been rebuilt in a context of understanding, not just genetic ties. Sister, he used to address her when they saw each other, but now the word bore love, not the cold of the hive mind. Are you happy? It was definitely not a question that Cassandra ever saw coming. Happiness sounded like such a little word for what it had turned her into. She wasn't the terrified teenager who'd run from that invasion, no more the desolate survivor who'd existed in the wreckage. She was emergent, unprecedented. But as she stood in the garden memorial, encompassed by the soft worry of biological mechanisms that had learned to serve rather than rule, she knew that happiness was what she had, not the perfect contentment of the collective consciousness, but the messy, complicated, and even contradictory happiness of personal choice. Above, her ship swirled, no longer a swarm of war, but a dance of rejoicing. They had learned to play, to probe, to dream, and within their freedom, Cassandra had found hers. The war had stolen everything from her, her family, her home, her species' innocence. But it had also bestowed upon her one precious thing, that in even the most extreme circumstances, there was choice. That freedom wasn't freedom from connection, but freedom to choose among connections. She had followed the WASP armada and lived to turn their own weapons against them, and learned what was the greatest victory when it was not by killing your enemy but by making him your friend. The future spread out before her, dark and unknown, and for the first time in her existence Cassandra Thorne wasn't afraid. The sun was setting on New Haven, and the sky was bright gold and rose. In the distance, biomechanoid structures throbbed, with a soft glow, their cadences not dictated by an external hand, but woven into the web of kindred unity. In the gardens played children, some human, others having the less apparent signs of a biomechanical upgrade, all free to choose their own destinies. Cassandra smiled, the satisfaction of her 4 ships snuggling in for the night coursing through her veins. Tomorrow would present new challenges, new chances to see what was, and to know what came to be of their world changed. But tonight she didn't care about any of that. She was alive and free, and she knew she'd had a hand in helping create a future where choice was more than possible. It was an honor. The girl who had escaped the invasion was now the woman who had made it, and in those changes, she had found that the most powerful strength was not standing on your own but standing together.